Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues. I have the honor to declare the special meeting of the Permanent Council open pursuant to Article 14 of the Statute of the Permanent Council and Article 37 of its Rules of Procedure. The meeting was convened at the request of the Permanent Mission of Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Paraguay, and Peru, according to the document CP document 5499/19, with a view to considering the situation in Venezuela and the draft resolution contained as attachment in the same document. In accordance with Article 43 of the Rules of Procedure of the Permanent Council, we will proceed to adopt the order of business for the meeting CP 0D2217/19. Without any objection. Yes. We'll take 1 second. The interpretation's coming in Spanish. Is the interpreter in Spanish working? Yes? So I'll start from the beginning one more time. I have the honor to declare the special meeting of the Permanent Council open pursuant to Article 14 of the Statute of the Permanent Council and Article 34 of its Rules of Procedure. The meeting was convened at the request of the Permanent Missions of Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Paraguay, and Peru, according to the document CP document 5499/19, with a view to considering the situation in Venezuela and the draft resolutions contained as attachments in the same document. In accordance with Article 43 of the Rules of Procedure of the Permanent Council, we will proceed to adopt the order of business for the meeting, document CP 0D2217/19. Without objection, we will show that document adopted. We have Venezuela.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Hay una lista.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a list of 4 countries that were waiting for you to call on us just before you made the decision. Mr. Chairman, this is our position on the order of the day, which we'd like to be included in the resolution. And if the draft resolution is approved, we would like to request the footnote that we're submitting to the Secretariat. Mr. Chairman, the OAS does not have the authority to recognize or not recognize the governments of member states. That authority does not exist and does not provide in any legal document. The first reason is quite simple. The act of recognizing the government is an action taken on individual and sovereign basis by each state. And as a political act, it cannot be imposed on other states because they would therefore lose their sovereign right to govern their international relations. This explains why never in the past has an attempt been made to implement this violation of international law. The second and very clear reason, which demonstrates why the OAS nor any other state can change a delegation that is representing a member state, is the following. To recognize another government is an act completely different from appointing the national authority of a country. A state has the power to recognize or not recognize a government, but a state never can nominate or assign the authority of another country. In other words, recognition does not determine who can sit as a representative of a government. Each are 2 very different acts, and in the history of the OAS, we have never mixed them up. If this is allowed, you are therefore eliminating national sovereignty, popular sovereignty, and we would be living in the world, not of international law, but in the law of the strongest or the most numerous. The only measure envisaged in the OAS standards is the suspension of a member state, which has to be decided at a special General Assembly with 2/3 of the votes of the foreign ministers. There is no other means of doing that. There's no other means of changing a government. Any improvisation or manipulation that allows for different action by a body and is done by less than two-thirds is illegal and is changing the rules and the historic practice to ensure the rights of all members. That's why we now find ourselves with two coups d'etats. One that has been committed against all the principles of the OAS, and the other one committed by the OAS against the state, which is imposing representation from abroad. What is going to happen today, Mr. Chairman, is the end of a chain of violations and tricks that has converted the OAS into a weapon against Venezuela and has violated the international's foundation that was built by the OAS. It has now made this House uninhabitable. We have, as occurred on the 3rd of April, 2017, we have encouraged the Secretary General that promotes war against Venezuela. And now we have become accomplices of all the measures and distortions that violate the rights of our people and plunder our wealth, including the threat of the use of military force against our nation. All of these are mass violations of the OAS Charter, and all of those initiated here. An attempt to approve within the Permanent Council with a simple majority of members the expulsion of our delegation and the imposition of an individual that would take the seat of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela would be remembered as a violent and abusive act. It's as illegal and as absurd because for the very first time you would sit here a representative of a country that the OAS does not recognize. With at least 24 votes, you recognize President Nicolás Maduro. Why is it that this rule doesn't exist? It's because it would be impossible for it to exist. Mr. Chairman, the only way that I, as a representative of the Venezuelan state, a full member of this organization with all the rights that we have exercised for more than 70 years, the only way that I can leave this chair without violating international law, without violence, tricks, fraud, legal manipulation, etc., would be for you to have in your hands a resolution adopted by the Special General Assembly of the OAS where 24 states would have voted for the suspension of the rights of the state of Venezuela in this organization. But without that resolution from the General Assembly, any act is null and void, and it means we are putting to an end the OAS Charter. The OAS will continue to exist, but only as a ghost of what it has wanted to be and could not be. And to conclude what's going to happen today, you are confirming that you never had the necessary votes to work with a majority in this region, nor did you have any interest in respecting the principles, the rules, and the practices of the OAS. All of these coercive measures, threats, insults could not be imposed, so you had to break the appearance of respecting rights and violate the entire organization. You have converted the OAS into an empty shell that has violated its own principles. And you're now proving that our decision to resign was the correct one. We are leaving the OAS and we will never come back.
St. Vincent and the Grenadines, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, Chair of the Permanent Council, distinguished permanent representatives and alternates, permanent observers, staff of the Secretariat, good afternoon. Chair, the delegation of St. Vincent and the Grenadines begs leave to highlight some critical and salient points relative to the substance of the draft order of business for this special meeting of the Permanent Council, and to express great concern on the matter. This Permanent Council, by virtue of the processes, actions, and systematized atrocities culminating in the crafting of the contents of the draft resolution to be considered here today, is advancing on a path which is sure to lead to the irrevocable dismantling of this organization, as it flouts and disregards the very charter establishing it, while discarding the long-established principles and precepts of international law. International law exists to guide interactions and to protect all states in any given situation. To disregard international law, therefore, is to remove all semblance of respect for the sovereignty of states. To engage in acts such as those proposed in and implied by the draft resolution is to strip the Charter of the Organization of American States of its power. The Permanent Council has arrogated to itself powers and an authority not vested in it by the Charter of the Organization of American States. It violates in every way, and among many, Article 1 of its nature and purposes. Chair, the Charter of this organization does not give it the power to legitimize or not the government of a sovereign state. The OAS is not a government. Therefore, the Permanent Council is not a government. This present overreach by the Permanent Council is consequently an illegal act. It is not the function of the Permanent Council to accept any appointees other than those presented by the constitutionally and democratically elected leader of a member state. In this present instance, the duly elected president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. That function reposes in the highest authorities, the General Assembly. The adoption of the draft resolution today will no doubt vitiate the legal and regulatory framework by which the organization is to be guided in its operation. It will establish a bad precedent and find itself too fractured to redeem itself. Chair, without any fear whatsoever of being overly dramatic, my delegation concludes with an excerpt from the poem, The Second Coming, by William Butler Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you. The ambassador from Uruguay is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Estamos en este momento.
At the moment, we are considering the draft order of business. And the draft order of business that has been proposed includes, under item 2, the consideration of the draft resolution on the situation in Venezuela, and following that, the comments by representatives of member states. In every international organization, and thus within the OAS, first, one offers the possibility to member states to comment on the topic that has been proposed, and following that, the draft resolution that is being proposed is considered. Article 52 of the Rules of Procedure of the Permanent Council states, and I read literally, the chair or any representative, when he or she considers that a matter has been sufficiently discussed, may propose that debate be closed. And I would like to repeat, when he or she considers that a matter has been sufficiently discussed. To this end, it's important to note, Mr. Chairman, that sufficient time has to be allowed at the beginning for discussion and debate before closing the debate. In this regard, Mr. Chairman, we would like to propose or ask you a question for clarification as to whether you will allow sufficient time, as is required, for debate and interventions of delegations first, before any course of action is taken or any decision is made about the draft resolution. And appreciate a response. Thank you.
The delegation from Nicaragua is recognized.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The delegation of Nicaragua rejects the call for this meeting, and therefore we do not agree with the order of business, which includes a resolution that discusses a matter that is not covered by any article in the charter of the OAS. Under no circumstances can a national government depend on the political discretion of another government or a group of foreign countries, because every American state has the right to respect the rights of other states according to international law. The delegation of Nicaragua, should we vote on this resolution, reserves the right to submit an explanation of its vote, and if so, will say that our declaration should appear as a footnote should the resolution be adopted. Mr. Chairman, I had asked for a point of order earlier because those who preceded me talked about the draft resolution, and I would like to request that according to the rules of our procedure, we first vote on the order of business according to Article 42.
Adoption of the draft order of business. We will proceed to voting on it. Ambassador from Antigua and Barbuda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think we have a proposal from the distinguished ambassador of Uruguay that there should be a discussion on this resolution before there is a vote on it. And on the Articles 56 and 52, I would like to second that proposal, Mr. Chairman.
So that we don't get out of order, let's proceed with the adoption or rejection of the order of the day. And when we arrive at point 2 in the situation, you could raise that motion and it will be dealt with accordingly. We're now on point 1 of the agenda, which is the adoption of the draft order of business. There's been a motion. Ambassador from Antigua and Barbuda, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have to tell you that I dislike enormously having to interrupt you as chairman of this meeting, and I don't like having to make points of order. But I think that you have a proposal and a seconder before you, and the rules of this organization demand that we should look at that before we look at anything else. Thank you, Mr. And you can seek legal advice, sir, because I see the legal advisor is there.
Ambassador Sanders, there's no need. We were trying to go in order on point 1. You're asking for a motion as to point 2 regarding debate prior and after the consideration of the resolution. See it as you may. We will proceed to vote as to whether there should be discussion prior and after the presentation of the situation in Venezuela resolution. We will proceed to vote. All those who vote in favor would like to have debate prior and after the presentation of the resolution. All those who vote against, 1 second please, all those who vote against will like to not have debate prior and after the resolution. Ambassador from Mexico.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a point of order. The proposal you have made is not complying with the rules of procedure. Either we adopt the agenda or we do not adopt it. We cannot adopt a conditional agenda. Now, if you would like to have a discussion on whether the agenda can specifically allow for discussion before the adoption of the resolution, then we can discuss that. But the manner in which you have proposed the vote is not possible. Either we adopt the agenda or we don't adopt it. Now, having said this, I'd like to remind everyone who's present that in order to proceed to a vote, we have to close the discussion first. If we were to vote on closing discussion, we would have to have 2/3 votes in favor of closing the discussion. That's important to keep in mind when we discuss adopting the agenda and also when we discuss item 2 of the agenda. I'd like to insist, if you want to proceed to voting for the adoption of the agenda or not, it's yes or no. Whoever votes yes is not forced to not discuss or not speak before we adopt the resolution. It's important that we follow procedures carefully and we be very strict in following legal procedures.
Here, I would like to have approved the agenda prior to the motion made by the ambassador of Uruguay and second by the ambassador from Antigua and Barbuda, and then dealt with the motion made by the ambassador from Uruguay and second by the ambassador of Antigua and Barbuda once we proceeded to point 2. It seems like there was some objection to that ruling. So at this point, we will move to adopt the agenda. All in favor of adopting the agenda, we will proceed to a roll call vote for the adoption of the agenda. The first country that will vote is Bolivia. This is for the adoption of the agenda, just to be clear on what we're voting on.
Estamos en contra.
We vote against.
A favor da adoção.
Brazil,
A favor da adoção.
Favor.
Canada,
In favor.
Chile,
A favor.
In favor. In favor. In favor.
A favor.
In favor.
Against.
Ecuador,
A favor.
In favor.
En contra.
Against.
Guatemala,
A favor.
In favor.
Abstain.
Haiti,
A favor.
In favor.
Honduras,
A favor.
In favor.
Favor.
Mexico,
In favor.
Nicaragua,
Against. No.
Favor.
In favor.
A favor.
In favor. In favor.
Dominican Republic,
In favor.
St. Lucia, St. Kitts, I'm sorry, I couldn't see you. St. Kitts,
Abstain.
St. Lucia,
In favor.
St. Vincent and the Grenadines,
Against.
Suriname,
Against.
Trinidad and Tobago,
To abstain.
Uruguay,
En contra.
Venezuela,
Against.
En contra.
Against.
Antigua and Barbuda,
Against.
Argentina,
A favor.
Bahamas,
In favor.
Barbados,
Abstain.
Belize. Belize is absent. By your vote, the agenda is approved. We will now proceed to the situation in Venezuela. Consideration of the draft resolution on the situation in Venezuela. Delegation from Colombia, you are recognized to explain your resolution. I'm assuming, Ambassador from Mexico, I'm assuming this is as to point 2, just to be clear.
Señor presidente,
The
agradezco.
ambassador, one second, the ambassador from El Salvador, recognized.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How many were in favor? How many abstentions? What is the result of the vote?
There was 19 in favor, we'll give you, there was 1 absent, and we'll give you the full count now. I'll recognize you to explain the vote count.
Votos.
19 votes in favor, 10 votes against, 4 abstentions, and 1 absence.
The agenda is approved. We'll now proceed to the explanation of the situation in Venezuela, draft resolution document 5499/19 by the ambassador from Colombia. You are recognized. Microphone, please.
Señor presidente, Señor
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished ambassadors, I would like to thank you for having responded to the request to convene this special session of the Permanent Council, which was requested by the missions of Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Paraguay, and Peru. And according to the agenda, I am now referring to the draft resolution that has been submitted to the member states for their consideration and was attached to the note requesting the convocation of this permanent council meeting. The text that I am referring to has the co-sponsorship of the same states I read out earlier as requesting the convocation of this meeting. This draft resolution is the outcome of a series of decisions made both by the General Assembly as well as the Permanent Council. The Permanent Council, beginning in 2017, April of 2017, expressed its concern for the change in the constitutional order taking place in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and in fact authorized a meeting for consultation purposes of the foreign ministers. Again, in February of 2018, it urged that the election be rescheduled because of the lack of guarantees provided during that election. Again, on the 10th of January of this year, this Permanent Council declared the lack of legitimacy of the mandate of the one who claims to be president of Venezuela, Mr. Maduro. And the Permanent Council declared that the National Assembly was legitimate. Also, the General Assembly of the OAS declared the electoral process of the 20th of January of 2018 as lacking legitimacy because there was a lack of participation by other political actors, and the vote did not meet international standards. There was a lack of guarantees. So in the resolution that is being submitted to you, we specifically mention, first, Resolution 2929, dated June 5, 2018 of the General Assembly, as well as Resolution 1117, dated January 10th, 2019. In this resolution, the OAS has as its foundation Article 80 of the Charter of the OAS, as well as Article 3 of the Statutes of the Permanent Council. And it takes the draft resolution I'm submitting also takes note of the letter written on the 22 of January 2019 sent by the National Assembly to the General Secretariat of the OAS, a letter in which Mr. Gustavo Tarré Briceño is nominated as permanent representative. And finally, in the operative section, it recognizes that the presidential authority of Nicolás Maduro lacks legitimacy and that his appointments to public positions therefore lack the necessary legitimacy. Therefore, we It resolves to first accept the appointment of Mr. Gustavo Tarre as the permanent representative for the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to the Permanent Council of the OAS, and to instruct the Secretary General to transmit the text of this resolution to the Secretary General of the United Nations. That is the text of this draft resolution, and I therefore have now introduced it, submitted it, and ask that the chair submit this resolution to a vote.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now recognize the Ambassador from Mexico.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the discussion on the diplomatic representation of a state to the OAS is separate from the political situation in Venezuela or in any other state. Diplomatic representation of a state to a regional body is based on legal considerations derived from the standards of international law that govern and regulate the constitution of our body and the representation of the states represented here. So what is at stake here is not the situation of a country or another country, but rather the institutionality of the OAS, its structure, its relationship to member states, and the proper functioning of its rules. We are running the risk of adopting a resolution that will have significant impact on the future of the organization based on the legal foundation. Any decision made today will become precedent that can be invoked by other stakeholders tomorrow under a different context with different results, and which will apply to all ambassadors present here today and any of those that follow us in the future. Mexico also keeps in mind that the OAS is not a body that is isolated from the international community. In the Article 1 of our charter, it states that within the United Nations, the Organization of American States is a regional body. And this organization is therefore part of a global family of organizations where our nations, including the state we're discussing today, are represented. We are concerned that here we may operate in an irresponsible manner without legal grounds and create inconsistency between all of these organizations and the implications that may lead to. It's not legally practical to determine that a state is represented by delegations that respond to other national authorities. How do you explain the fact that the representative of a country to the OAS has to respond to a different national authority from the one that is represented before the UN? What implications would that have for international law? At the United Nations, for instance, this kind of matter is discussed by the Committee on the Verification of Powers, which has the power to discuss this and make recommendations to the General Assembly, which is the supreme body that will consider the final decision. A decision as delicate as the one we have before us cannot be resolved through a simple majority of vote. It requires a much more in-depth and grounded study, and definitely not within this body of the OAS, which is inferior to making the kind of decisions and the implications that kind of decision would have. The OAS Charter states that the Organization of American States does not have any other power than the ones that expressly conferred upon it by the Charter. Therefore, there is no legal basis for this Permanent Council or the General Secretariat to decide on the validity of the representation of a member state. And even if there is no instrument, the power of the OAS on this would have to be raised to the General Assembly, because that is the supreme body of the OAS. That's the logic, which means that a manner of less impact, that is merely an administrative one, such as the approval of the annual budget of the organization, must be undertaken at a special General Assembly and by a majority of 2/3. Is anybody willing to argue that the recognition or non-recognition of an ambassador, of a permanent representative, it is less important than the approval of the budget?
OAS Charter is not about argument about the representation of a state before the organization. However, based on the charter itself of the OAS, the General Assembly is the supreme body of the OAS, Article 54 of the charter. And among its major powers is to decide the policy of the organization, to determine the structure of its bodies, and to consider any matter relating to the peaceful coexistence or interaction of American states. This is subsection A of Article 54. And then in this controversy, this assembly is in charge. This body is in charge of this, and there's considerable implications with regard to the participation of members in all acts of a government. This decision requires both a recommendation of the Permanent Council as well as a vote in the General Assembly of 2/3 of the member states, as is the case with the decision of voting a country in as a member to the organization. As a matter of fact, this is what happened in the latest relevant precedent of the OAS's history, when on October 3rd, 1991, there was a consultation meeting of the foreign ministers which was convened to deal with a situation of Haiti, recognized the diplomatic representatives of President at the time, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, as the only legitimate representative of the constitutionally elected government of Haiti vis-a-vis or to the organization, a resolution which was approved by consensus, but in any case it would require a two-thirds majority in the Permanent Council. And lastly, we have to look at the latest developments in the financial system, in the inter-American system, to learn about the effects for the good of the health of the OAS. It's absolutely fundamental to make decisions that don't lead to paralysis of the organization. And so therefore, I would like to make one last comment within my remarks. I'm very surprised that the draft resolution speaks of appointing before the Permanent Council as a permanent representative, not before the OAS, as if there was a possibility of having one representative before the Permanent Council, another one before the organization. I think for the authors of the resolution, there's an inconsistency. And there's one representative before the OAS, and there's not a representative before the Permanent Council, and another one before the CAP or other. But this is a task for those who have proposed the resolution. Thank you very much.
Next, recognize the ambassador from Uruguay. I ask all delegations to keep your interventions to 10 minutes or less in accordance with the rules. You're recognized.
Thank you very much, Chair. Uruguay has voiced its opinion about the profound political, economic, and social crisis of Venezuela, and continues to work hand in hand with other countries to attempt to cooperate to come up with a peaceful and political solution based on dialogue between the parties. But the issue is that some delegations are raising before this body is substantially different from this, and it pertains to a respect to the institutional framework and the rules of the organization. With regard to the strict adherence to the procedures that were agreed upon by the countries and that they undertook to comply with, it's a guarantee for every state. Our remarks are going to be about what rules are applicable to the situation that has been arisen before this organization and other similar situations that may arise in the future. And so with regard to the dangerous precedent that a decision of this nature may create in the future, Dr. Eduardo Jimenez Arrechega, an accomplished jurist from Uruguay who was the president of the International Court of Justice, is the author of a specific paper about recognition of states and governments, included in Volume 2 of it's called Public International Laws, and the name of this work. And what it says, and I quote, in the current status of international law, the states are not willing to apply recognition and delegate a body, in other words, to substitute individual recognition for collective recognition. That's the end of the quote. Now, in a complimentary note, which is in the same works, it says, and I quote verbatim, there is no international body in which that law gives the power of collective recognition, close quote. In the same regard, there has been a pronouncement from Mr. Guaidó, both the Secretary General of the UN, who underscored that it is not the organization whose job it is to recognize governments, but rather the member states' job. And the European Union, under statutorily, also is lacking in this power as to figure out who is the legitimate representative before this council, which it's totally without competence to do so. And so only the member states can do so. And so this would be subjugating the legality of the OAS. So my country can't be for undermining the legality of this. And with regards to international organization, the credentials should be approved by any of the representatives that come before it. In this case, this is not what's going on because the state of Venezuela already has its designated representative before the organization, the OAS, based on Article 54 of the OAS Charter. It says that the General Assembly is the supreme organ of the Organization of American States. With referring to Article 54 of the Charter, it established that the General Assembly has different powers, which include the power to, and I quote, to decide the general action and policy of the organization, determine the structure and functions of its organs, and consider any matter relating to friendly relations among the American states. A. And so among these principal powers, and I read it, is to strengthen and coordinate cooperation with the United Nations and its specialized agencies. C. And this power, and these powers are set forth in the Charter for the General Assembly, not to the Permanent Council in this regard, and thus, based on what I'm just saying, it is the OAS General Assembly is the competent organ to decide an issue of the magnitude and import that is being raised here in this instant, and it's not the Permanent Council's job. And with such a magnitude, such as what we're discussing here in the past, this was addressed by the ministers of foreign relations at a General Assembly or at a meeting of ministers of foreign relations, and not with the ambassadors at a Permanent Council meeting. What the Permanent Council can do is possibly call a special assembly to have the approval of 2/3 of the member states, that is 24 votes. Likewise, the Permanent Council convenes a regular General Assembly every year. In 2019, it has been determined that it will take place in June, this June. We must also underscore that several of the proposing countries tried to propose a consultation meeting of the ministers of foreign relations to consider the situation in Venezuela, which had two levels. One was in May of 2017 in Washington is when it was held one time, and another time in Cancun in June in 2017. In this regard, we must bear in mind that in a timely way it was said that the 21st meeting of foreign relations ministers, it was held open. And so, to summarize, and as we said at the beginning of my remarks, the rules with regard to recognition is individual recognition. What I mean by that is each state can act on its own, can recognize or not recognize the government of a particular state. And there doesn't exist any international body to have the power to issue collective recognition. And this is the case in the OAS as well in other states where this could come about in the future. Uruguay believes that based on the rules and procedures of the OAS and the competent body to deal with this, issue is the General Assembly and not the Permanent Council. We can say in advance that in case that the General Assembly deals with this, our vote would be also against a decision of this nature. We must underscore the importance of respecting the legal standards that all and norms that all states have agreed to respect in view of the fact that the guarantee thereof is important for the setting of precedents and that may be established for the future. Uruguay is not going to go along with a resolution because it is inconsistent with the rules and the institutional framework of the organization. And if should this be adopted by the Permanent Council, Uruguay will request that be included therein a footnote with its position set forth clearly. And to wrap up, Chairman, we issue an alert and conveys its concern with regard to the division that draft resolutions of this nature will create in an organization, which will make it more difficult, if possible, the possibility to create opportunities to lead to a peaceful political solution that are based on the guiding principles of international law with regard to the situation that Venezuela is going through. Thank you.
Guyana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As this delegation has consistently made clear, the government of Guyana shares the concerns of OAS member states and other members of the international community over the continuing political and economic problems in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. These problems have resulted in a humanitarian crisis of immense proportions, leading to an exodus of hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans into neighboring countries, including Guyana. The government of Guyana has assisted the many Venezuelans who have sought refuge in Guyana. It has had to put systems in place to monitor their entry and to allow for their access to basic social services. The government of Guyana will maintain this policy to assist Venezuelans who turn to Guyana at this time for humanitarian support. The government of Guyana acknowledges the ongoing political and constitutional crisis in Venezuela and reiterates its disposition to continue participating in regional efforts as a member state of both CARICOM and the OAS, as a member of the Lima Group, and as a responsible member of the international community to help resolve the situation for the benefit of the Venezuelan people. Mr. Chairman, on January 10, 2019, increasingly preoccupied by the worsening of the crisis in Venezuela and by anti-democratic actions that had and continue to have grave implications not only for national stability there, but also for regional peace and security, Guyana joined with other countries in inter alia not recognizing the legitimacy of Mr. Nicolas Maduro's new term as of that same date, and in calling for new presidential elections with all necessary guarantees for a free, fair, transparent and legitimate process. We maintain that position, but I wish to make it clear that the government of Guyana has not recognized Mr. Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. Suffice to say that we do not believe that non-recognition of one implies automatic recognition of another. The problem is far too complex for such a binary decision, and indeed for the implicit application of such a principle to the draft resolution before the Permanent Council today. We believe that it is the holding of new presidential elections in Venezuela that should be pursued in the interests of establishing constitutional and democratic order and the ultimate business of recognition or non-recognition of a president. Mr. Chairman, permit me to repeat what I said on March 28, 2017 at a meeting of this Council to discuss the situation in Venezuela with regard to our guiding principles in this matter. I quote, "We unreservedly support respect for the sovereignty of states and the principle of non-intervention. We, as a small state, appreciate the importance of multilateralism and wish to continue working with all member states to maintain the relevance, integrity, and sustainability of the Organization of American States. Allow me to reaffirm our belief that multilateral diplomacy encompasses several mechanisms to which we all subscribe, based on mutual respect and dialogue, aimed at protecting the weak from the strong." Mr. Chairman, 2 years later, these principles are as important as ever. The presentation of this draft resolution, however, threatens to undermine these very principles and the institutional integrity of this organization, of which we are proud to be a member. This matter is of high political importance. The acceptance of a representative suggests the recognition of a particular government. In international law, there is no collective recognition of a government. That is the sovereign right of states. Indeed, Mr. Chairman, I would like to remind colleagues of one of the key underlying principles enshrined in AG Res 1080 on representative democracy adopted at the 21st General Assembly in Santiago, Chile on June 5, 1991, to the effect that, I quote, due respect must be accorded to the policies of each member country in regard to the recognition of states and governments, end of quote. Mr. Chairman, I wish to bring to your attention a few points before I conclude. These points bother me a little. The agreement of the Venezuelan National Assembly of January 22, 2019, first circulated by the Secretary General to member states, speaks of the designation of Mr. Gustavo Tare Briceño as the special representative of Venezuela to the OAS. The most recent letter, also dated January 22, 2019, circulated by the Secretary General, speaks of the designation of Mr. Tare as the permanent representative of Venezuela to the OAS. Moreover, this letter is signed by Mr. Juan Guaido as President of the National Assembly and as interim President of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to recall that Mr. Guaido was proclaimed interim President on January 23, 2019, one day after the letter was dispatched. Mr. Chairman, these discrepancies undermine the integrity of this draft resolution, which we will have difficulty in supporting. My delegation does not believe that the OAS, which is not a supranational body, can impose by a simple majority vote recognition, implied or otherwise, of any government. This is a matter for high-level political consideration, for the consideration of our highest authorities, our ministers of foreign affairs. We therefore submit that it should be addressed by either reopening the ministerial consultation on Venezuela or by convening a special General Assembly. To do otherwise would be to fly in the face of reason and the search for consensus, no matter how painstaking that might be. And it would set a dangerous precedent and ultimately damage irreparably the institutional framework of the Organization of American States, belying the claim that this is the premier political forum of the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you. Recognizing Ambassador from Antigua and Barbuda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I will not repeat those points made by other delegations with which my delegation entirely agrees, except to say that with regard to the remarks made by the distinguished Ambassador of Mexico, my delegation not only agrees with him, but entirely endorses his presentation. But I wanted to go, Mr. Chairman, if I could, beyond the resolution that is before us, and to consider, in fact, its consequences for this organization. Mr. Chairman, the presentation of this resolution is part of a disturbing trend in which any simple majority of 18 member states can impose their will on all other member states. This trend, Chairman, assaults the fundamental ethos of this organization, which is to build consensus always in its decision-making. It is a sad day in the OAS when any group of member states can override the dissenting opinions of others simply to achieve their own desires. It is a curious form of democracy. Decisions will not be sustainable or comfortable if they are imposed by simple majorities, despite the deep and valid concerns of others. This process will lead to a fractured organization in which mistrust and antagonism will replace trust and cooperation, which is vital to its success. No organization will long exist in such division. Mr. Chairman, this resolution is based on two other resolutions, one of June 5th, 2018, and another of January 10th, 2019. And I urge this Permanent Council to bear in mind that these resolutions did not command the support of many of the member states here gathered. The resolution also relies on Article 80 of the OAS Charter and Article 3 of the Statutes of the Permanent Council. For the record, my delegation points out that Article 80 states that the Permanent Council of the organization is composed of one representative of each member state, especially appointed by the respective government with the rank of ambassador. Each government may accredit an acting representative as well as such alternates and advisors as it considers necessary. And Article 3 of the Statutes of the Permanent Council states that the government of each member state shall advise the Secretary General of the appointment of its representative and the appointment of its alternate representatives and advisors, and when called for, its interim representatives. It goes on to say that the Secretary General shall in turn inform the Permanent Council whenever a member state accredits a new permanent representative to the organization. This, Mr. Chairman, brings us to the fundamental point at issue in this resolution and before this organization right now. And that is recognition of governments and the criteria for doing so. The recognition of a government is the sovereign right of each government of a state acting by its own volition. No multilateral organization, such as the Organization of American States, can dictate to any sovereign state what government it should recognize. That is the sovereign right of governments only. What is being sought here is a dangerous precedent in international norms and practices, and that is to empower a multilateral organization to usurp the rights of sovereign governments. But as a practical matter, Mr. Chairman, when this debate is over and the votes are cast, individual governments will still determine, as is their right, what governments they recognize. Nothing will have changed. What it will achieve is an organization overwhelmed by suspicion and crippled by a failure to adhere to its own ethos to build consensus on major decisions. And, Mr. Chairman, the resolution before us does call for a major decision. It is not a trifling matter. Further, nowhere in its rules or statutes, including the quoted Article 3 cited in this resolution, nowhere in those statutes does the Permanent Council have the authority or power to recognize a government. A matter of this magnitude should be determined at the very least by a committee of foreign ministers. And my delegation points out to this gathering that the meeting of foreign ministers on the situation in Venezuela is still open. This matter could have been referred to that committee very easily. And if this Permanent Council wanted to deal with this matter in an open and transparent manner that is consistent with the Charter and the rules of the organization, the issue should have been referred to the Committee of Foreign Ministers. Now, Chairman, regarding the criteria for recognition of a government, in international law and practice, such recognition is based on the test of who is in charge of the country, who administers its affairs, who controls its borders. In arriving at this resolution, this essential test of international law has been ignored. Mr. Chairman, my delegation regrets to say that in its view, the resolution disregards international norms and practices. It ignores the rules of the Permanent Council and the Charter of the Organization of American States. And it attempts to compromise the sovereign rights of governments to decide in their own determination what government they recognize and by what criteria. The founding fathers of the OAS observed in the principles set forth in the Charter that, and I quote, international order consists essentially of respect for the personality, sovereignty, and independence of states, and the faithful fulfillment of obligations derived from treaties and other sources of international law. This resolution ignores those principles. In this connection, Mr. Chairman, my delegation indicates at this time that should this resolution be adopted, despite all that is said here, my delegation would wish to add a footnote to it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ambassador. I recognize the Ambassador from El Salvador.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary General. We believe that democracy and the defense of human rights necessarily require respect for universal principles and inter-American principles that govern the coexistence and relationship between our nations. In this regard, this is not a question of being in favor or against a government, a governor, or a form of government. That is a decision up to the sovereign states. It is rather a question of respecting the rules and processes established within our inter-American instruments and respecting the institutionality which we are attempting to violate in order to attain a political goal. The future of our organization depends on all decisions made today. That is why we cannot, nor should we, attribute to the Permanent Council decisions that are not within its competence. My delegation would like to call for reflection and for following due process, first of all, by exhausting all possibilities of relevant dialogue as established by our own rules. Also, we would like to appeal to strengthening the dialogue and to promoting consensus instead of deepening division, which is obvious, and which can only lead to a greater weakening or paralysis of this institution. Member states in the past, in the very recent past, have demonstrated that it is possible to reach consensus on matters of great relevance that affect our relationships. We therefore need to give our foreign ministers the opportunity, since they are the superior authority for the Permanent Council, to debate this matter and give their decision to the Permanent Council. In this way, we would avoid very dangerous precedent that in the future may be applied to other countries facing similar situations. My delegation, finally, would like to request that the minutes reflect that El Salvador does not support any decision adopted by this Permanent Council which violates the spirit and the rules of international law. And if a resolution is adopted, El Salvador would request that a footnote be attached to that resolution. In conclusion, I'd like to quote Edmund Burke, who said that in a democracy, the majority of the citizens are able to exercise the cruelest repression against the minority. We don't need votes for that. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize the delegate from Jamaica.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues, ambassadors, alternative representatives. Mr. Chairman, I take this opportunity to reiterate Jamaica's amendment to the draft text, which is not reflected in the current text before us. As such, I will read the text and ask that it be incorporated and circulated in the final draft of the resolution. The changes to be effected to operative paragraph 1, and I quote, to accept the appointment of Mr. Gustavo Tare as the National Assembly's designated representative, pending new elections and the appointment of a democratically elected government. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Just to clarify, that's in lieu of the language that's currently in the draft resolution.
Yes, Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize the Ambassador from Bolivia.
Muchas gracias, presidente.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to everyone. Let me refer to the draft resolution that was submitted yesterday and which we are considering today, which does not have the necessary legal grounds because Article 1 of the Charter states specifically that the Organization of American States has no other powers other than those empowered by the Charter. And none of the articles in the Charter gives the Permanent Council the power to make decisions on the submission of letters of credential, nor to recognize or not recognize governments. It envisages the suspension of a government as the only sanction that can be approved, and it must be approved by 2/3 of the General Assembly, which is the supreme body of this organization. So any measure that claims that the organization should recognize or not recognize a government or its representatives appointed by it has no legal value. Therefore, the draft resolution that we have before us is a violation of the institutionality of the organization and jeopardizes our credibility because the recognition of a government or the representatives of a government is a sovereign right, a unilateral right, and in no way can it be the product of a collective act, as this draft resolution that we are considering is. I would like to appeal to thinking about this to avoid flagrant violation of international law and approval of a resolution that violate the practices and diplomatic relations between our states, and if it should be approved, would set a nefarious precedent for multilateralism. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Recognize Nicaragua.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The delegation of Nicaragua believes that the draft resolution that has been submitted is illegal because it violates the Charter of the Organization of American States and its other instruments. Because the Charter does not provide for nor envisage the power, nor does it grant power to the Permanent Council to have the right to recognize, not recognize, or designate the governments of its governments or its representatives to those governments. The recognition of a state or government is a sovereign right by each state, and it's a unilateral action. It is illegal to supplant the representation of the state of Venezuela in the Permanent Council, and to make a decision about this is null and void, and it represents a flagrant violation of the Charter of the OAS and its other instruments. It therefore will not be valid, nor will it have any legal effect, nor establish any precedent. We would request that this comment by the government of Nicaragua appear as a footnote in this resolution. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have asked for the floor to make some comments on the content of the draft resolution that is being proposed, and some comments on issues that I think need to be addressed during this debate. Let me begin by saying that there is has been a great deal of confusion made by various speakers between two international law institutions that are completely different. One is the recognition of a government, and the second is the accreditation of a representative by a state to an international organization. What I mean is that recognizing a government, and on this all of us agree, the recognition of a government is not to be determined by international organization unless it can implicitly have an effect, because it could be that a state votes in favor of accepting the nomination of an individual made by a state, but that's different. Here, in our debate, I think we are confusing these two matters. Secondly, I'd like to say that Article 80 of the OAS Charter is the only provision that refers to the representation of a state. And it says representation of a state, not recognition. That's Article 80, which clearly establishes that the Permanent Council of the organization is composed of one representative of each member state, especially appointed by the respective government with the rank of ambassador. In other words, that's the article under which this resolution has been presented. What this resolution clearly states, it said it's accepting the nomination of Gustavo Tarré as the permanent representative of Venezuela to the Permanent Council. We are, and we must abide by this rule, this article. Nowhere does it say that the representation of a state has to be accepted by the General Assembly. I understand that there it's a case if it has to be applied to the entire organization, but here we're limiting ourselves specifically to the Permanent Council. Nowhere in the OAS Charter does it talk about a two-thirds requirement for the General Assembly to make a decision on such a matter. In other words, Article 59 of the Charter specifically states as a general rule that the decisions of the General Assembly shall be adopted by the affirmative vote of an absolute majority of the member states, except in those cases that require two-thirds vote. And I see no provision within the Charter that states that the representative of a state has to be approved by two-thirds. So I think we are confusing, we have confusion during this debate, and I think it's very important to clarify the issue. So the only rule that applies is Article 80 of the OAS Charter. And Article 80 specifically refers to the representation before the Permanent Council. And then if we look at the statutes of the Permanent Council, following this umbrella of Article 80 of the General Assembly, we then have Articles 2 and 3 that very specifically refer to the membership of the Permanent Council. Article 2, under membership, says the Permanent Council is composed of one representative of each member state, especially accredited by the government thereof with the rank of ambassador. Then you have Article 3 that says this has been advised to the Secretary General, and the Secretary General and then advises the Permanent Council. Now, with regard to quorum, this is a decision that is made by the Permanent Council. Now, within the framework of the Permanent Council and under the rules of vote and the quorum required for the Permanent Council, what is the rule in the Permanent Council for quorum? A majority of votes. I did want to make this clarification. These are legal clarifications, Mr. Chairman, in order to reaffirm the full legality and in compliance with international law and in compliance of the Charter of this draft resolution that has been presented.
Thank you, Ambassador. I recognize now the delegation from Dominica. One second. There's a point of order from Antigua and Barbuda. You recognize?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have to admit to being somewhat confused. And before this discussion continues, I think we need to clarify the point. We have a resolution before us, which we have started discussing. Then there was an intervention from the distinguished delegate of Jamaica to suggest that he'd made amendments to it. And I'm not now sure what we are actually debating here. Is it the original resolution, or it is the resolution with Jamaica's language? If it's Jamaica's language, I have not seen it. I've heard him read it, but I've not seen it. And I would very much like to see it, to study it, if indeed it is now part of the resolution. But I think we need some clarity here, sir. Thank you very much.
I guess just to clarify, was the Jamaica's amendment distributed to the room? I'm not sure. Has the amendment by Jamaica been distributed to the room?
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not sure, but there was a request for it to be distributed to all delegations.
So we will work on getting that distributed. To be clear, and I know it's just everybody would like to see it in written text, the amendment states clearly to accept the appointment of Mr. Gustavo Tarre as National Assembly's designated representative, pending elections and the appointment of a democratically elected government. That is the text that's being proposed by Jamaica. It will be distributed. Returning to the debate, I believe countries could decide if they would like to address the amendment, which will be distributed shortly, or the underlying resolution. They have the ability to address both or either. If any country would like to address the resolution, who hasn't done so, we will also give them some latitude to readdress the chamber regarding the resolution if they've already addressed the text of the draft as written. We'll proceed to Dominica.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, permanent representatives, alternates, good afternoon. Mr. Chairman, the government of the Commonwealth of Dominica reiterates its previously expressed position on its recognition of the government of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and views with the gravest concern this resolution before the Permanent Council this afternoon. This resolution calls on member states of this organization to accept the appointment of a representative of a self-declared government outside of the electoral process, a position that we opine is inconsistent with international law and the Charter of the Organization of American States. The government of the Commonwealth of Dominica recognizes the government of Nicolas Maduro as the duly elected president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and as such, accepts and recognizes the appointments made by him. We are all aware that there is a divergence of views in respect of the recognition of Nicolas Maduro government and the self-declared government of Juan Guaido. This is therefore not a normal situation that the Organization of American States finds itself in. This matter of such high import and has what we consider such grave implications for this organization that we consider that such a resolution which seeks the recognition or acceptance of a representative of a country where there are two parties claiming to be the legitimate head of that same country should and must properly be submitted for consideration to the General Assembly, the supreme body of the Organization of American States, for its consideration by ministers of foreign affairs. The adoption of this draft resolution by this body gathered here today would introduce a most disturbing and dangerous precedent on how the Organization of American States will manage similar situations were they to occur in the future. This is an opportunity for the organization to show leadership and to show that in this most extraordinary of circumstances, that such a serious decision is submitted to the highest decision-making body within the organization for its consideration. Given the expressed concerns regarding this resolution, The government of the Commonwealth of Dominica vigorously and unreservedly opposes this draft resolution and requests that if this resolution is proceeded with and carries, that its position be footnoted in this resolution as follows. The government of the Commonwealth of Dominica does not support this resolution as its purport is to delegitimize a duly elected government, recognizes a representative of a self-declared government, and by so doing is inconsistent with the OAS Charter and international law, and most importantly, sets a dangerous precedent regarding how such matters will be dealt with by the Organization of American States hereafter. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize the ambassador from St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Thank you, Chair. Pardon me for taking the floor a second time. I simply wish to indicate that my delegation will submit a footnote in the event that the draft resolution to be considered is approved. Thank you, Chair.
I recognize the ambassador from Suriname.
Thank you, Chairman, Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, permanent representatives, ladies and gentlemen. The delegation of the Republic of Suriname wishes to indicate that the government of Suriname will cast a vote against the resolution as it has been presented this morning by the delegation of Colombia. In this regard, we want to refer to our principled position of rendering our unwavering support to the guiding principles of international law as enshrined in the UN Charter, the OAS Charter, and other legal instruments of the OAS. The government of the Republic of Suriname expresses its serious concerns regarding the selective interpretation of the procedural rules and other legal instruments of the organization and wishes to point to the negative precedents that are being set in international law and in the functioning of multilateralism. Henceforth, my government is of the view that the text of this resolution does not reflect an appropriate legal value due to the fact that it represents serious inconsistencies with the accepted principles and norms of international law and international relations. The government of Suriname wishes to inform the Council that a footnote will be submitted on short term to the General Secretariat with a request to include it as part of the resolution should it be approved today. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I think it'll be in order so that all the delegations have an opportunity to review the Jamaican amendments, that we take a 5-minute break and give the Secretariat an opportunity to distribute that. Without objection, we'll stand in informal recess for 5 minutes.